As more and more Americans are dealing or becoming more despondent with the state of the United States, there's a growing population of Americans that are expatriating. Not to mention, there have already been thousands of Americans that have left over the last few decades. And the reason for expatriating could be jobs. It could be because of improved quality of life. But the most recent immigrants immigrating has to do probably because of the political shifts, the social economic shifts that have caused many Americans to become despondent. And whatever the policies, whatever party that American may belong to, there's a growing consensus that whatever it is not working. And many Americans are just despondent with the state of the country. And so with the question of expatriating, there is also the question of whether an American should renounce their citizenship and the implications of renouncing US citizenship, which we'll discuss in this video. Whatever your reasons for moving abroad, renouncing citizenship from the US is a whole separate discussion, and I'm not here to argue for it or against it. That's not my job. My job is to present the implications, the pros and cons, just so you have a framework for your decision. And there's other experts out there that you should consult with, because the decision to renounce your citizenship should not be taken lightly. And it is a difficult and expensive process, and we'll get into it in this video. So the first thing you need to know, despite your political affiliation, what side of the aisle you're on regarding the United States, renouncing your citizenship is a complex and lengthy process. There are forms you have to fill out. You have to make a declaration of oath at an embassy. You also have to be interviewed to see if you are of sound mind and body before you make that decision. And there's also an investigatory period where they look into your background to make sure you're not renouncing your citizenship because of tax reasons. And yes, you have to pay a fee of around $2,350. That alone would make me not want to do it, and that's just me. And then it takes several years. It's a lengthy process. It's not something where you could walk into the US Embassy and request to renounce your US citizenship. As a matter of fact, there's only a few embassies around the world that handle renunciation processes. Essentially, when you renounce your citizenship, what are you giving up? You're giving up your voting rights in the US election. You're also losing your ability to pass down your US citizenship to children. And you also lose access to limited consular assistance abroad. If something were to happen, if a pandemic were to happen or a conflict were to happen, you lose the ability for the US to send a helicopter essentially and rescue you. But many would argue the US has not provided that services to Americans who are in foreign territories for at least 30 or 40 years. The US has lost its reputation in terms of intervening with other governments when it comes to US citizens. So that image of the US sending a helicopter to rescue you, that is no longer an image that is relative to the US. So that's not necessarily something that you should think about that you're giving up. Other countries are a lot more aggressive regarding handling consular services and rescuing their nationals in the event a conflict or a pandemic breaks out. What you're not giving up, despite renunciation, applicants who do it properly can still maintain their Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid entitlements. Such individuals can also travel to the US as visitors based on the passport that they currently hold without much difficulty. As long as that passport allows you to travel to the US, you can travel just like a visitor. Whether you need a visa, you have to realize that you no longer have the status as a US citizenship. So you take on all of the policies of that country and the treaties that the US has respective to that country. So if the US requires a visa for nationals of that country to travel to the US, you are subject to that. Your previous status as a US citizen does not matter. You do not get any favoritism regarding entering the US. So you have to keep that in mind if you plan on returning to the US regularly. In terms of taxes, now the US citizens are always considered US tax residents, even if they reside in a foreign country or claim residency elsewhere. They are subject based on their citizenship. It's a citizenship-based taxation, meaning as a US citizen, you must report and pay taxes on worldwide income and assets. until you formally renounce your citizenship. As we know, at the heart of most recent renunciations, it lies at the unique tax burden that is imposed on U.S. citizens, a burden of taxation of all of one's worldwide income. So this consideration is typically for high net worth individuals, not necessarily the average person wanting to relocate because of healthcare, more time freedom, more financial freedom, a better quality of life, a community. The consideration around the tax burden is typically reserved for wealthy individuals. Most people just want a better quality of life. However, even green card holders residing outside of the US are also still implicated under this tax program and subject to US tax obligation unless they formally renounce their status as a green card holder of the US. So you can't only abandon the US, you also have to legally surrender and terminate your green card by applying to the appropriate citizen and immigration services to ensure that you no longer have a connection with the US and therefore are no longer responsible for any tax liabilities or obligations. As I mentioned, the high net worth individuals that are renouncing their citizenship has to do with the recent tax scheme that the US rolled out under the Obama administration, specifically the Foreign Account Tax Compliant Act, also known as FATCA. Now, this is a federal law requiring all non-US foreign financial institutions to search their records for any customers with a connection to the US. How they determine connection has to do with whether this individual previously had residency in the US or their nationality is a US nationality. So they're responsible for reporting this to the US Treasury. Before FATCA, this law was passed in 2010. Now, before FATCA, the IRS had limited ability to even detect, let alone thoroughly investigate assets held offshore in foreign entities. So now, under FATCA, financial accounts held offshore are subject to a level of scrutiny necessary to ensure these US taxpayers are tax compliant. FATCA was designed to help ensure that every American is a taxpayer, no matter where they choose to earn income or store their financial assets, and to ensure that they're paying the correct amount of taxes. FATCA also requires self-reporting, meaning the individual is supposed to report their foreign assets, their foreign banking institutions on their taxes yearly. So it's self-reporting, and if that person does not report, then it's up to the banking institutions in those countries to report it. In essence, it's a snitching program or a disclosure program that was introduced requiring banks in foreign jurisdictions to report on bank balances of those with connections to the US, because it was believed that there's perhaps trillions of dollars of revenue of US citizens that is not being reported and not being taxed. So that was the impetus for FATCA that was passed under the Obama administration. And a bank is likely to comply with this because if not, the bank will lose their ability to conduct business in the US and have access to US banking system. And for that reason, foreign banks are compliant because they don't want to lose access to the American banking system, which is one of the most robust and secure in the globe. And so FATCA would allow detection of a person who have not reported on their taxes this asset or this income. The interesting thing about the US tax law, as I mentioned earlier, is that under US tax law, US persons, regardless of their residence, are generally required to report and pay US federal income taxes from all sources. The US and Eritrea are the only two countries worldwide where non-residents have to report on taxes. So those living abroad, even though they're not a resident and do not benefit from the laws of the land, from the fire department, the police department, the hospitals, the roads, the infrastructure, they're still liable. And the US makes it so that it has a strong arm into these countries' banking systems to require reporting if this person, in the event, does not self-report on their tax returns. So like I said, the reason for this draconian policy was that the US was just losing too much revenue. It was reported that $100 billion annually from offshore tax non-compliance. Again, this is subjective. There's no quantifiable way that the government knows how much was evaded before this law was passed. But the US definitely wanted to have their hands on it because that's a sizable amount of money that can be taxed and therefore used in the US. There's a lot of money out there that the US did not have access to tax, and so they enforced this law to make sure the banking institutions were compliant. And the issue not so much of taxes. I think currently the issue is that the taxes are not funding government. The taxes are not being used in a way to make the country robust and secure. Many Americans feel that their tax monies are being squandered, that services are being cut. So where is the tax revenue going? Is it being pocketed? Many Americans wonder. So as it relates to your US citizenship, as you understand, as I've hopefully laid out to you, you understand that taxes is a major issue why the new movement of expatriates have decided to expatriate. They just don't want the US following them or intermeddling in their financial affairs if they're not a resident of the US. And I'm not here to argue for it, against it. It's just information to know. But for the average person who doesn't have the amount of resources that, say, a millionaire or a billionaire may have, your framework for deciding to renounce your citizenship has to be done carefully. You have to make sure that you have a backup passport that is as powerful or more powerful than the US passport. Also, you want to make sure you're not rendered stateless while you're renouncing your US citizenship, that you have permission to be in another country. In terms of extradition, even if you renounce your US citizenship, you can still be extradited to the US if that country has an extradition treaty with the US. And there's several countries that don't, China being one of them, Vatican City is another one. North Korea, Russia, Vietnam, there's several countries that do not have extradition policies and therefore are not required to extradite a person who may be wanted in the US. Also, in terms of renunciation, you have to go to specific US embassies in order to begin the process. It's not any and every US embassy, a consulate around the globe, that actually processes renunciation paperwork. Certain embassies do, such as Stockholm, Helsinki US Embassy, the consulate in Thailand, Vietnam, Costa Rica, Oman, and there's several others that also process renunciation paperwork. So that is the background regarding renouncing your citizenship. Again, it's not something to be taken lightly. Americans have done it historically in the past, but it would behoove you to have another nationality before you renounce your US passport, because as of date, despite the political instability, the economic instability the US is having, it's still a strong passport. So you want to make sure you go through the process with mindful of the implications before you do it, just based on a whim, based on the frustrations of living in the US. If you have any questions regarding it, my link is in the description box. I also have a Move Abroad course, so if you're interested in moving abroad and you do not know where to begin, then I would think about joining that. We will iron out the things that you need to be considering if you want to move abroad, such as the visa process. Can you meet the minimum eligibility requirements of that country? What to do with your stuff in the US? Should you sell it? As well as if you have small children, what to do with your small children, especially if there's a custody agreement in place, how to deal with healthcare in the new country, what happens to your Medicaid and Medicare in the US. So we iron out all the implications regarding moving abroad so you could do it successfully with as little angst as possible, because it can be anxiety provoking. There is discourse out there where you could just pack your stuff and relocate with no problem. But if you have more dynamic issues in your life, in your family, it would behoove you to settle those, or at least have a plan of action for them before you just pick up and go. Despite whoever is in office, you always want to dot your I's and cross your T's. And that's what my Move Abroad program advocates for. I like to do things the legally responsible way. I'm an attorney, so I make sure things are done thoroughly and with backup plans. So if you would like to come into my coaching container, the link will be in the description box, or you could check out my website, Access Wellness Global. And I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.